Humans built temples, pyramids, tombs, and cities, but across the ancient world, people were also searching for something else. Not wealth, not power, a different state of mind. They left traces of that search in flowers, leaves, smoke, medicine, and sacred drinks whose meanings are still debated today. So how far back does this search really go? And what were they trying to reach? These objects are small enough to hold in one hand. The questions surrounding them are much larger. Around 1450 to 1200 BCE, potters in Cyprus were making a narrow clay vessel unlike most others in the Bronze Age world. It could have looked like just another container, one more object among thousands of broken pots, bowls, and jars, except for its shape. The rounded body and narrow neck resembled an upside-down poppy capsule. Some examples even carried pale painted lines, almost like the marks left when a poppy head is cut and its milky sap begins to run. For decades, archaeologists looked at these Cypriot base ring juglets and wondered whether the resemblance was accidental. Were these vessels shaped like poppies because they once carried something made from poppies? If so, then the ancient search for altered states did not begin as a legend, a rumor, or a strange line in a sacred text. It began as trade. Because these juglets were not found in one isolated village, they moved through the eastern Mediterranean world, from Cyprus into regions connected with the Levant, Egypt, and the wider Bronze Age exchange network. A vessel like this was not just a local object. It moved through a world of merchants, ships, palaces, burials, gifts, and rare commodities. That is what makes the possibility so important. If opium was being carried through these networks, then it was not just a plant growing quietly in the background of ancient life. It may have already become something people valued enough to harvest, package, transport, and possibly bury with the dead. But archaeology rarely gives an answer that simple. For a long time, the poppy-shaped juglets looked like a clue. Then residue analysis complicated the story. Some tested vessels showed no trace of opium at all. Instead, they appeared to have contained perfumed or aromatic oils. If that was true, the entire opium theory was in trouble. Maybe the shape was being overread. Maybe these were perfume containers. Maybe modern researchers were seeing opium because they expected to see it. Then the evidence shifted again. In 2018, researchers analyzed residue from a late Bronze Age Cypriot base ring juglet and detected alkaloids associated with the opium poppy, including papaverine and thebaine. It did not prove that every juglet carried opium, but it did show that the old suspicion could not simply be dismissed. Something connected to the poppy had survived inside one of these ancient vessels. Then the mystery left the trade routes and entered the grave. At Tel Yehud in modern Israel, archaeologists studied vessels from burials dating to the 14th century BCE. Inside some of them, chemical analysis found opioid alkaloids and their decomposition products. These were not just containers sitting in a storeroom or crossing a trade route. They were connected to the dead. That changes everything about how the evidence is interpreted. Were people placing opium in graves as a luxury, as medicine for the next world, as an offering, as part of a ritual meant to comfort the living, honor the dead, or help the soul cross into whatever came after? We do not know. The evidence does not allow us to say that every Bronze Age juglet held opium. It does not tell us exactly who used it, how often, or what they believed it could do. But it does show something important. More than 3,000 years ago, opium was already close enough to trade, burial, and ritual that its traces can still be found today. What survives is not a myth. It is a clay vessel, a poppy-shaped clue, and traces that still refuse to give a clear answer. Were Bronze Age people trading medicine, luxury, ritual power, or something that was all three? But not every trace of this ancient search was carried through trade. Some were painted into tombs placed beside the dead, and repeated so often that they begin to feel deliberate. In 1922, when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, the dead king was not surrounded only by gold. There were chariots, shrines, weapons, jewelry, and the famous golden mask. Yet among all that wealth, archaeologists also found something far more fragile. Flowers that had been placed with the body, woven into garlands, and left to dry in the sealed darkness for roughly 3,000 years. Tutankhamun was buried in the late 18th dynasty, around 1323 BCE. By then, the blue water lily was already deeply woven into Egyptian religious and funerary imagery. Often called the blue lotus, this plant was not a random decoration. In Egypt, it carried one of the strongest meanings imaginable: rebirth. It rose from water, opened with the light, and closed again as darkness fell. To a culture that watched the sun vanish each evening and return each morning, that rhythm had power. A bloom that opened with the sun could become a sign of resurrection, a promise that life might rise again. That symbolism is clear. The harder part is explaining why the same flower appears so often in the hands of the living. Across New Kingdom, tomb paintings and banquet scenes, especially from the period between about 1550 and 1070 BCE, men and women are repeatedly shown holding the blue lotus close to the face. Sometimes the gesture looks casual, sometimes it feels ceremonial. Either way, it appears often enough to raise a different kind of question. Why show people smelling it so often? Was it simply perfume, beauty, status, and divine renewal? Or was the act itself part of the experience? Modern chemistry makes the image harder to dismiss as decoration alone. Blue lotus contains compounds that may have mild effects on the body and mind, often described as calming, sedative, or gently euphoric. That does not mean every lotus scene hides a powerful drug ritual, and it does not mean ancient Egypt was secretly explaining itself through one plant. The evidence does not go that far. What it does show is more subtle. The lotus appears near the living and the dead, in scenes of pleasure, ceremony, rebirth, and transition. It belonged to the visual language of Egypt, but it may also have belonged to the physical atmosphere of ritual itself. Some researchers have suggested that the blue water lily may have been soaked in wine or used in prepared mixtures, where its effects could have been experienced differently than from the flower alone. That possibility becomes more interesting because of a much later clue. In the Ptolemaic period, more than 1,000 years after Tutankhamun, a ritual vessel associated with the god Bez preserved traces of a complex mixture that included compounds linked to blue water lily. That vessel dates to around the 2nd century BCE, so it cannot explain every earlier tomb scene. Still, it matters because it shows the plant could appear in prepared ritual mixtures, not only in paintings. It does not solve the meaning of the lotus, but it makes the repeated imagery harder to treat as decoration alone. That is why the blue lotus is difficult to reduce to one role. It could be a symbol of rebirth, a perfume, a sacred object, a banquet image, a funerary offering, or a ritual ingredient. The problem is that those meanings do not cancel each other out. In ancient Egypt, the same object could belong to beauty, death, religion, and lived experience at once. Maybe that is why the lotus appears so often at the edge of life and death, not because it meant only one thing, because several meanings overlapped. Egypt left its clues in painted walls, dried garlands, and repeated gestures. Far away in the Andes, the next evidence would be harder to separate from the body itself. A dried leaf rarely survives for thousands of years, but the habit of chewing one can leave marks behind. That is what makes coca different from many other traces in the ancient world. The evidence does not appear only in images, vessels, or ritual objects. Sometimes it survives in the body itself, in strands of hair, in teeth, in mummified remains, and in small bags that once carried leaves across the mountains. The plant was coca, and long before it became tied to the Inca, it had already been part of Andean life for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence from northern Peru suggests coca use may reach back around 8,000 years before present, pushing the story far earlier than the empire most people associate with it today. Coca was not a late invention of power. It was older than that, much older. Coca leaves are not the same as the modern purified drug made from them. Traditional use was slower and milder, usually involving leaves held in the mouth and often combined with alkaline substances like lime or ash to help release their active compounds. The effects were practical as much as sensory: reduced fatigue, less hunger, stimulation, and help with endurance in high-altitude landscapes where thin air, cold, long journeys, and demanding labor-shaped daily life. This was not simply escape from reality. In the Andes, it may have helped people endure reality. That is where coca becomes difficult to place into a single category. It was useful, but it was not only practical. It belonged to movement, labor, offering, identity, and ritual, crossing lines that modern categories often try to keep separate. The physical evidence makes that clear. Studies of mummified remains from northern Chile have found signs of coca use dating back at least to around 1000 BCE, and chemical analysis of mummy hair can reveal traces of what a person consumed during life. In other cases, teeth preserve patterns of wear linked to the long habit of holding coca leaves in the mouth. A plant can decay and a gesture can vanish, yet a repeated habit may leave marks on the body. We are not only dealing with a symbolic plant or a mysterious image. The human body itself becomes part of the archaeological record. Over time, coca became deeply woven into the mountain world around it. It was used in offerings, carried in pouches, exchanged between people, and connected with sacred landscapes where mountains, ancestors, and natural forces were not treated as empty scenery. They were active presences, and coca could belong to the relationship between people and those forces. The mystery is not whether ancient Andean people used coca. They did. The deeper question is how one plant became so deeply tied to both ordinary endurance and sacred meaning. Was coca honored because it helped people face the harshness of the highlands, or did the difficult act of living in that landscape become ritualized through coca itself? The ritual dimension becomes harder to ignore in the late pre-Columbian Andes. Around 1500 CE, high on a volcanic summit more than 6,000 meters above sea level, 3 children were placed in a ceremonial context, now linked to capacocha, one of the most solemn state rituals of the Inca world. Their preservation was extraordinary, and later hair analysis suggested that coca and alcohol consumption increased in the months before the final ritual period. Handled carefully, that evidence says something important. Coca was not only for workers, travelers, or ordinary endurance. It could also appear inside highly controlled sacred ceremonies, where the body, the mountain, the empire, and the gods were drawn into one ritual act. That gives coca a strange place in this story. It was daily and sacred, practical and ceremonial, connected to the living and present with the dead. It did not always mark an escape from ordinary life. Sometimes it marked the point where ordinary life, under extreme conditions, became sacred. Coca left its trace in teeth, hair, pouches, and preserved leaves. The next evidence would survive differently, not as something chewed, but as smoke rising from ritual fires beside the dead. Around 500 BCE, high in the eastern Pamir Mountains, people were burying their dead with wooden braziers. At first, the objects looked like part of a mortuary setting. Small vessels connected to fire, heat, and whatever rites took place around the grave. They were not golden treasures, and they did not announce their meaning immediately. Their importance came from what survived inside them. Chemical analysis showed that cannabis had been burned there. That discovery changes what the braziers were. The plant was not simply placed beside the body as an offering, and it was not preserved as a bundle of leaves. At Jiuzhankal Cemetery, in what is now Western China, cannabis appears as something transformed by fire. It became part of the air. A substance swallowed or chewed stays close to one body. Smoke behaves differently. It fills a space, surrounds the people gathered there, and turns the atmosphere itself into part of the ceremony. If cannabis was burned during mortuary rites, then the altered state was no longer only individual. It could become shared, surrounding the living as they stood near those being buried. The science makes the case stronger. Researchers found chemical markers showing that cannabis had been heated in the braziers, and the evidence suggested that the plants used at Jiuzhankal had relatively high levels of psychoactive compounds compared with many wild cannabis varieties. This may point to stronger plants being selected, though whether people cultivated them deliberately or found naturally potent cannabis in the high-altitude environment remains uncertain. The evidence does not support a modern fantasy about casual intoxication. What it gives us is stranger and more serious. A cemetery, braziers, burned residue, and a ritual setting where fire changed the plant before people breathed it in. A wider clue comes from the Yanghai tombs in Xinjiang, where a grave dating to around 700 BCE, roughly 2,700 years ago, contained a large amount of well-preserved cannabis plant material. That find does not give us the same fire and residue seen as Jiuzhankal, yet it shows that cannabis had already entered burial contexts in the wider region. The plant was not appearing randomly. It was close to ceremony, memory, and the preparation of the body for whatever people believed came next. Jazankel is different for one reason. The plant was not only buried, it was burned. Why use cannabis this way during a funeral or burial rite? Was the smoke meant to comfort the living? Was it meant to honor the person being buried? Did it alter the perception of the people taking part, making the ceremony feel closer to the unseen world? Or was the smoke itself the offering, something rising from the grave space and disappearing into the air? We cannot recover the thoughts of the mourners, and the chemical evidence cannot tell us what they believed they were experiencing. It can only show that the ritual involved more than objects placed in a tomb. It involved fire, breath, scent, and a plant capable of changing the body and mind. That is what makes Jazankel so important to this story. Cannabis was not just present in the burial, it was activated there. It was burned, inhaled, and shared in a place where every object already belonged to farewell, memory, and the unknown. The altered state had moved from a private act into the air around the grave. Smoke could change the space around a body. Other plants worked inside the body itself, where the line between medicine and danger was much thinner. Before modern anesthesia, pain was not a detail of medicine. It was one of its greatest obstacles. A healer could cut, burn, stitch, extract, or cauterize, but the patient still had to endure what was being done. In that world, any plant that could dull sensation, force sleep, or change awareness was not merely useful, it was powerful. And power was the problem. Mandrake and henbane occupied a narrow and unstable place in ancient medicine. They were not gentle remedies gathered for comfort. They were plants with effects strong enough to help, yet difficult enough to control. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman writers were treating them as part of medicine, not just superstition. Dioscorides, writing in De Materia Medica, described plants and preparations used for sleep, treatment, and pain relief, while Pliny the Elder recorded their strange properties in natural history. These were not modern clinical instructions, and they did not come with safe laboratory dosing, but they show that ancient medicine was already working with substances capable of pushing a person into altered states. Mandrake carried the darker reputation. Its root could resemble a human form, a detail that later helped surround it with legends, while the older medical interest was more practical. Mandrake was associated with narcotic effects, sleep, and reduced suffering. In some ancient descriptions, preparations of the plant were connected with cutting or cauterizing, placing it near one of the most frightening spaces in early medicine, the moment when a patient needed relief. But the remedy itself was not forgiving. A plant that could help someone survive a procedure could also pull them too far from ordinary awareness. Henbane made that boundary even thinner. Like mandrake, it was known in ancient medicine, yet its effects could be unpredictable and severe. It could sedate, dull sensation, and distort perception, while the wrong amount could bring confusion, agitation, delirium, hallucinations, poisoning, and physical reactions. Ancient healers could not fully manage. The danger here was not symbolic. It was physical. Here, altered states were no longer distant, symbolic, or atmospheric. They were placed directly inside the patient's struggle with suffering. Ancient healers were not guessing blindly. They observed effects, preserved knowledge, and tried to turn unstable plants into tools. Yet the same quality that made those plants useful also made them costly. Without modern anesthesia, purified compounds, careful monitoring, or precise dosing, relief and poisoning could stand dangerously close together. When a healer gave one of these plants to a patient, was that treatment or a calculated step toward the edge? The answer may be both. In a world where illness and treatment were often surrounded by religion, ritual, and fear, a patient might sleep, dream, lose awareness, or enter a confused state that seemed to place them somewhere between suffering and escape. That does not make the practice fantasy. It makes it more human. People were trying to survive pain with the tools they had, even when those tools carried serious consequences. That is what makes mandrake and henbane so important to this story. They show that altered states were not always sought for ceremony, pleasure, or contact with the divine. Sometimes they were pursued because medicine itself needed a way past pain. The price was uncertainty. The reward was relief. Between those two stood the ancient healer, holding a plant that could soften suffering or push the patient into something far harder to control. With mandrake and henbane, the risk was inside the body. In Greece, the next mystery centered on a drink almost no one was allowed to explain. For centuries, people traveled to Eleusis, a sanctuary near Athens, to take part in one of the most famous religious rites of the ancient Greek world. Many entered. Almost none explained what happened inside. By the 6th century BCE, Eleusis had become one of the great sacred destinations near Athens, and its mysteries continued for centuries through the classical, Hellenistic, and Roman worlds. It did not remain a village rite. It became one of the most respected initiatory traditions of the Mediterranean. At the heart of the rites stood a story of loss and return. Demeter loses her daughter Persephone to the underworld. The earth becomes barren. Grief spreads into the natural world itself. Then Persephone returns, and with her return comes growth, fertility, and the promise that descent does not have to be the end. That myth gave the rites their central pattern: absence, darkness, return. One part of the ritual was a drink. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Demeter refuses wine and accepts kykeon, a mixture traditionally described as water, barley, and pennyroyal. The ingredients sound simple, almost ordinary, and that is part of what makes the mystery so difficult. Ancient sources give us the cup, the name, and the sacred context. They do not give us the central moment. Initiates were forbidden to reveal the heart of the mysteries. Because of that, history preserves the outer shape of Eleusis: the sanctuary, the procession, fasting, purification, the sacred story, the drink, and the fact of initiation. What it does not preserve is the revelation that made generations of people believe the rite mattered. The outer shape survived, the center did not. That is why kykeon has become one of the most debated ritual drinks of the ancient world. Some researchers have suggested that it may have been more than ceremonial, perhaps prepared in a way that altered perception or involved compounds not obvious from the simple list of ingredients. Others remain cautious because the evidence is indirect, and water, barley, and pennyroyal do not prove a psychoactive preparation by themselves. The real mystery is not only whether kykeon was a drug, it is whether the force of Eleusis came from the drink, the fasting, the darkness, the myth, the expectation, the secrecy, or all those elements working together inside a rite no outsider was meant to understand. A simple drink can become something very different when it is consumed after preparation, after travel, after silence, after fear, after the story of a goddess losing and regaining her daughter has already shaped the mind of everyone present. Maybe kykeon did alter perception, maybe the ritual around it did. Maybe separating the two is the modern mistake. For the initiates, the meaning may never have belonged to the cup alone. It may have belonged to the entire passage into Eleusis, where a drink was placed inside a protected encounter with death, return, and renewal. The secrecy preserved the power of the rite for those who entered, but it also destroyed the explanation for everyone who came after. Thousands drank the kykeon. Whatever followed was considered too sacred to explain. Eleusis hid its central moment behind silence. Another ancient substance presents a different kind of loss. The words survived, the praise survived, but the substance itself may have disappeared. Soma does not come down to us as a preserved plant, a sealed vessel, or a residue waiting in the ground. It comes down to us through sacred language. In the early Vedic world, probably sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, hymns of the Rig Veda were already speaking of Soma as something powerful, sacred, and central to ritual. The exact dating of the Rig Veda remains debated, but Soma belongs to one of the oldest preserved layers of Indo-Aryan religious tradition, and in those ancient verses it was not treated as a minor ingredient. It was celebrated again and again. Soma was not a forgotten plant mentioned once in passing. It was described as a substance of force, inspiration, and divine connection, linked to sacrifice, gods, priests, ritual performance, and a state of being that ordinary life did not seem to provide. The texts do not describe only an idea, they describe a process. Soma was pressed, its juice was extracted, and the liquid was filtered, often described as passing through wool before being mixed with water or milk, offered to the gods, and consumed by those taking part in the ritual. That makes Soma difficult to dismiss as pure metaphor. In the earliest descriptions, it appears as something handled, prepared, poured, and drunk. Yet the texts never let us hold it clearly. Soma was a plant, but also a drink. It was an offering, but also something consumed. It belonged to ritual, but it was also treated almost like a sacred presence in itself. Even in the hymns, it does not sit comfortably inside one category, and perhaps that is why its disappearance feels so complete. The praise survived, the identity did not. For generations, scholars have tried to solve the problem by searching for the original plant or preparation. Some have proposed stimulants, others have pointed to mushrooms, desert plants, fermented mixtures, or links to the related Iranian Hauma tradition. Each theory tries to match the descriptions, the geography, the ritual process, and the effects suggested by the hymns, yet none has ended the debate. That uncertainty matters because Soma was not a small detail that slipped through history unnoticed. If the tradition remembered it so intensely, why can we no longer identify it with confidence? Was the original plant tied to a region later left behind? Did the preparation change as people moved? Were substitutes used over time until the first substance faded from memory? Or was Soma never one simple plant at all, but a ritual preparation whose meaning depended on how it was made, offered, and understood? This is where the mystery becomes larger than botany. Soma may have affected the body and mind, but reducing it to an ancient drug misses why it mattered. It belonged to sacrifice, sacred speech, priestly action, and the hope that a prepared substance could bring humans closer to the divine. Whatever its exact source, Soma was remembered as something that changed the ritual world around it. Over time, certainty disappeared. We are left with hymns that describe its preparation, traditions that preserve its name, and debates that still cannot fully recover the thing itself. The record tells us Soma mattered deeply, yet it refuses to return the one detail modern readers want most: what it actually was. Was Soma a plant, a drink, a preparation, a symbol, or something scholars have not yet identified with certainty? With Soma, the clearest trace is not an object, but a memory preserved in sacred language. The hymns tell us it was prepared, offered, consumed, and celebrated, yet they do not return the experience itself. A vessel, a flower, a leaf, smoke, a dangerous medicine, a secret drink, a substance whose name survived after its identity was lost. The record tells us what was used. It cannot tell us what it was like to be there. If one of these mysteries stayed with you, let it travel, like the video. Subscribe if you haven't, because some traces survive, some never do. The search continues here on Riddle Me This Mysteries.